Ilara Voss had a system. Every morning, she woke before the sun touched the mountains. She folded her gray uniform carefully, pressed it flat with her palms, and tied her dark hair back so tightly that not a single strand could fall loose and draw attention. She ate a small piece of bread in the servants' kitchen, alone, before the others arrived, and then she disappeared into the palace walls like a shadow that had learned, over many years, exactly how to move without being noticed. This was not an accident. It was a skill she had built, piece by piece, since the day she arrived at the palace of Varin Hollow at 16 years old, small, frightened, and carrying nothing but a name that meant very little to anyone who heard it. 8 years had passed since then. 8 years of gray hallways and cold stone floors, 8 years of replaced candles and polished silver and goblets filled with quiet precision, 8 years of standing in rooms where powerful people made enormous decisions and never once being looked at directly. And Lara had decided, very early on, that invisibility was not a punishment, it was protection. She watched the other servants, the ones who spoke too loudly, who smiled at the wrong person, who let themselves be noticed by the noble class, and she saw what happened to them. They were reassigned, corrected, used. She had no interest in any of that. She kept her head down, her steps soft, and her expression carefully blank, and in return, the palace allowed her to exist inside it without much trouble. The only complication was the Alpha King himself. Not because he paid her any attention, he never did. The complication was that she was assigned to his private wing, which meant she was closer to him than almost any other servant in the palace. She cleaned the stone floors outside his study. She laid out fresh linen in his chambers before dawn. She replaced the candles in the corridor he walked through every evening after his military councils ended. She had been 3 feet away from Cailan Duskmore, more times than she could count. And in all those times, he had never once looked at her. She told herself this was exactly what she wanted. Cailan Duskmore had not always been a cold man. Those who had known him before the loss, before the years of border wars and political weight and grief he wore like armor, said he used to laugh easily, that his wolf, Cale, had been playful and warm and prone to running through the mountain forests at dawn just for the pleasure of it. That was 5 years ago. Now Cailan moved through his palace like a man who had made peace with being alone. He was not cruel. He was simply closed, completely and deliberately closed, in the way that only someone who had once been wide open could manage. He ruled with precision and fairness. His generals respected him. His people were safe. The 12 surrounding packs kept their borders quiet, because none of them wanted to test what happened when the Alpha King of Varin Hollow was pushed. He had everything a king could need. He had decided, firmly and without much emotion, that this was enough. His wolf had been quiet for 5 years. Cale had not disappeared. Cailan could still feel him, a steady and ancient presence in his chest. But the wolf had gone still in a way that worried the royal healers and concerned his generals, though none of them said it directly to his face. A wolf that did not stir was a wolf that had given up on something. Everyone knew it. No one spoke of it. Cailan did not think about it. He had a kingdom to run. The summit arrived in the middle of autumn. 12 Alpha Lords descended on Varin Hollow with their delegations, their pride, their complicated political histories, and their very loud opinions about border treaties and pack law and the distribution of hunting territories across the northern mountain range. The palace, which was already large and serious, became something louder and more electric. Corridors filled with unfamiliar wolves, kitchens running at twice their normal pace, and servants moving at a speed that left no room for error. Ilara worked harder than she had in years. She was assigned to the most thankless corridors, the ones the visiting delegations used for informal meetings, the ones that needed to look perfect at all hours because an Alpha Lord might turn a corner at any moment and decide that the quality of the floor reflected the quality of the host. She did not complain. She never did. She simply worked, steady and quiet, and let the noise of the summit flow around her like water around a stone. The welcoming banquet was held on the 3rd night. The grand hall of Varin Hollow was enormous, a long, high-ceilinged room with stone walls hung with deep green and silver banners, lit by hundreds of candles in iron chandeliers that hung from the rafters like captured stars. 300 guests filled the long tables. The visiting Alpha Lords sat closest to the throne table, their wolves relaxed and watchful in the way powerful shifters always were in unfamiliar spaces, at ease on the surface, alert underneath. Kaelin sat at the head of it all, dressed in dark formal clothes, his expression controlled and his posture perfectly upright. He was mid-conversation with Alpha Lord Draveth, a large, red-haired man from the eastern mountain packs, who had strong opinions about the northern border and was not shy about sharing them. Alara was assigned to the servants' row along the lower section of the hall. Her job was simple: move along the tables, refill the ceremonial goblets with dark elderberry wine, stay invisible, and finish before anyone noticed she had been there. She was very good at this. She moved quietly along the row, goblet in hand, eyes down, shoulders slightly forward in the posture she had perfected over 8 years, small, forgettable, part of the furniture. The hall was warm and loud around her. Laughter from a delegation near the far wall, the low rumble of political conversation from the tables to her left, the clink of silver on ceramic, the smell of roasted meat and candlelight, and at least 12 different wolf packs all occupying the same space. She reached the end of her assigned row and paused to refill the last goblet. And then, something strange happened. It started with a change in the air, not a sound, not a movement, but a shift, the way the atmosphere in a room changes just before a storm arrives. Alara felt it without understanding it. Something in her chest, something she had no name for, something that had never stirred in her entire 24 years of life, pulled, hard. She looked up, confused, without meaning to. Across the grand hall, at the head of the throne table, Alpha King Kaelin Duskmore had gone completely still. He was no longer speaking. His sentence had stopped mid-word. Alpha Lord Draveth was still talking, but Kaelin was not hearing him. His jaw was tight. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, had closed into fists on the tablecloth. His eyes were moving, scanning the room with a slow, focused intensity that was not the controlled survey of a king monitoring his guests. It was the movement of a wolf, following a scent. Alara watched him without breathing. His gaze moved along the lower hall, past the visiting delegations, past the senior servants, along the servants' row, slowly, precisely. And then it stopped. On her. The moment his eyes found her, the entire room changed. It was not something Alara could explain later, no matter how many times she tried. It was as though the noise of the banquet fell away. Not gone, exactly, but distant, like hearing music from another room. Every nerve in her body was suddenly, intensely, overwhelmingly awake. The thing in her chest pulled again, harder this time, and she felt something move beneath her skin that she had never felt before, warm and golden and ancient, like something that had been sleeping underground for a very long time had just opened its eyes. She did not understand what was happening to her. She understood even less what was happening to him. Because Alpha King Kaelin Duskmore, the most powerful wolf sovereign in 3 centuries, a man who had not knelt to anything living or dead in his entire reign, rose slowly from his seat. And then, in front of 300 witnesses, 12 visiting Alpha Lords, his generals, his court, and the entire assembled power of the known wolf world, he went to one knee. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Alara had ever experienced in her life. No one moved, no one breathed. A goblet somewhere near the far wall tipped slightly, and was caught by a hand that moved on pure reflex, because its owner was too stunned to look away from the head of the room. Alpha Lord Draveth had stopped speaking. He was staring at the empty chair beside him, with an expression that suggested his mind had simply refused to process what it had just seen. Kaelin was kneeling on the stone floor of his own banquet hall. His head was slightly bowed. His fists were pressed against his thighs. Every line of his body was rigid, not with weakness, but with the particular tension of a man fighting something enormous that was winning anyway. And then, slowly, he raised his head and looked directly at Alara. Lady Seraphine Voss, seated 3 tables away among the noble guests, had gone the color of old paper. Head Steward Bram, standing at his post near the hall entrance, looked as though the stone floor had opened beneath him. Alara stood in the servants' row with a goblet in her hand and could not move. Her heart was beating so loudly she was certain the entire hall could hear it. The warm golden thing beneath her skin was pulling with a force she had no framework to understand, no language to describe, no experience to measure it against. She had spent 8 years making herself invisible. She had never felt so completely, terrifyingly seen in her life. Kalen rose from the floor slowly, with the careful control of a man who was rebuilding his composure one piece at a time. He straightened his jacket, he held his expression still, and then he walked across the grand hall in long, even strides that were much steadier than they had any right to be, given what had just happened. The crowd parted without being asked. 300 people simply moved out of his way, the way water moves when something large and certain passes through it. He stopped in front of Ilara. He was tall, much taller than she had ever consciously registered, despite 8 years of proximity. Up close, his gray eyes were not cold the way she had always assumed from a distance. They were still. There was a difference. Still was not cold. Still was something that had decided to stop moving, and was only now being asked to start again. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She could not have looked away if she had tried. He said, very quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it beneath the suffocating silence of the hall. "You have been here for 8 years, and I never once saw you." It was not an accusation. It did not carry anger or embarrassment, or the sharp edge of a man trying to recover his dignity. It sounded, in a way that caught Ilara completely off guard, like grief, like someone discovering too late that something precious had been sitting within arm's reach the whole time. Ilara, whose entire survival for 8 years had depended on the skill of not being seen, looked up at him and said the only honest thing she had left. "I know. I made sure of it." Something shifted in his expression, something deep and quiet, like a wall that was not falling, but had simply stopped holding quite so hard. The summit did not recover from that evening. The diplomatic conversations continued, because they had to, because 12 Alpha Lords had traveled a long way, and border treaties did not pause for personal revelations. But the atmosphere had changed entirely. The story moved through the palace like wind through an open window. A human-born Omega servant, a dormant king's wolf, awake for the first time in 5 years, a mate bond declared in the most public way imaginable. Lady Seraphine moved quickly. She stood before the assembly the following morning and spoke in a smooth, practiced voice about false bonds, rare documented cases where a powerful alpha's suppressed wolf produced a misdirected response, triggered by prolonged proximity to a particular scent. It was a condition, a mistake. Nothing more. The girl was a servant, a good one perhaps, but the bond was not real. Kalen listened to her without expression. That night, he summoned the royal archivist. By the time the sun rose over the mountains the next morning, he had sat with 300 years of bloodline records spread across the floor of his study, and he had found what Lady Seraphine had spent years carefully erasing. The Voss bloodline. Ancient, documented, carrying a recessive shifting gene so rare it had not surfaced in 4 generations, a gene that presented in its carriers as entirely human until the one specific biological trigger activated it. A true mate bond. Ilara was not human. She had never been human. Her wolf had not been absent. It had been asleep, waiting for the one thing that could wake it. And it had been 3 feet away from that thing, every single day, for 8 years. Kalen stood before the full assembly, 12 Alpha Lords, his generals, his court, and every noble in Varenhollow, and stripped Lady Seraphine's title in 4 sentences. He corrected the royal registry in 2. He stood at the head of the room with the bloodline records on the table beside him, and he looked at the gathered faces of the most powerful wolves in the known world, and he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "Varenhollow does not erase its people. It answers for them." Then he turned. Ilara was standing at the edge of the room. She had been brought in as a witness, still in her gray servant's uniform, still with that careful stillness she had worn for 8 years like a second skin. She looked at him across the space between them, with eyes that gave away nothing and everything at the same time. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He extended his hand, not with the authority of a king commanding a subject to follow, but with the particular care of someone who understood, for the first time, how long she had been standing alone, Alara looked at his hand. She thought about gray hallways, about cold floors and replaced candles, and the art of taking up as little space as possible. About 8 years of choosing to be unseen, because the world had never offered her a reason to be seen safely. Then she thought about a king, the most powerful wolf alive, on his knees in a room full of other kings, because of her. She took his hand. Inside Kaelin's chest, Kael, fully, completely awake for the first time in 5 years, let out a long, low breath. Not a growl, not a threat, something that sounded almost exactly like relief. That night, the palace was still busy with the noise of consequence, politics running its course, conversations buzzing through corridors, the machinery of power adjusting to a shift it had not anticipated. In the Alpha King's private chambers, a small fire burned low in the hearth. 2 cups of tea sat on a table between 2 chairs, neither touched, both cooling slowly. Alara sat across from Kaelin, her hands folded in her lap, her gray uniform still on, her posture still quietly careful in the way it always was. Kaelin leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes on her face with an attention that was still new enough to feel overwhelming. He said, carefully, like a man who had forgotten how to do something simple and was trying to remember, "Tell me something, anything, about yourself." Alara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like the whole world breathing. Then she looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had never allowed herself to before, and said, softly, "I have been waiting 8 years for someone to ask." Kaelin Duskmore looked at the small, still woman across from him, the woman his wolf had knelt for in front of the world, the woman who had moved through his palace like a shadow and survived by being invisible, the woman who had been 3 feet away from him for 8 years and whom he had never once seen. He smiled. It was not a small smile or a careful smile or the kind of smile a king wears in public. It was a real one, quiet and slightly uncertain, like something returning after a long winter. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the palace of Varenhollow felt, in one small room with a low fire and 2 cold cups of tea, like somewhere that a person could actually rest.